The History of Sexuality, Volume 1, An Introduction, by Michel Foucault. Part 2. The Repressive Hypothesis. 2. The Perverse Implantation. A possible objection. It would be a mistake to see in this proliferation of discourses merely a quantitative phenomenon, something like a pure increase, as if what was said in them were immaterial, as if the fact of speaking about sex were of itself more important than the forms of imperatives that were imposed on it by speaking about it. For was this transformation of sex into discourse not governed by the endeavor to expel from reality the forms of sexuality that were not amenable to the strict economy of reproduction, to say no to unproductive activities, to banish casual pleasures, to reduce or exclude practices whose object was not procreation? Through the various discourses, legal sanctions against minor perversions were multiplied. Sexual irregularity was annexed to mental illness. From childhood to old age, a norm of sexual development was defined, and all the possible deviations were carefully described. Pedagogical controls and medical treatments were organized. Around the least fantasies, moralists, but especially doctors, brandished the whole emphatic vocabulary of abomination. Were these anything more than means employed to absorb, for the benefit of a genitally centered sexuality, all the fruitless pleasures? All this garrulous attention which has us in a stew over sexuality, is it not motivated by one basic concern? To ensure population, to reproduce labor capacity, to perpetuate the form of social relations, in short, to constitute a sexuality that is economically useful and politically conservative? I still do not know whether this is the ultimate objective, but this much is certain. Reduction has not been the means employed for trying to achieve it. The 19th century and our own have been rather the age of multiplication, a dispersion of sexualities, a strengthening of their disparate forms, a multiple implantation of perversions. Our epoch has initiated sexual heterogeneities. Up to the end of the 18th century, 3 major explicit codes, apart from the customary regularities and constraints of opinion, governed sexual practices: canonical law, the Christian pastoral, and civil law. They determined, each in its own way, the division between licit and illicit. They were all centered on matrimonial relations. The marital obligation, the ability to fulfill it, the manner in which one complied with it, the requirements and violences that accompanied it, the useless or unwarranted caresses for which it was a pretext, its fecundity or the way one went about making it sterile, the moments when one demanded it, dangerous periods of pregnancy or breastfeeding, forbidden times of Lent or abstinence, its frequency or infrequency, and so on. It was this domain that was especially saturated with prescriptions. The sex of husband and wife was beset by rules and recommendations. The marriage relation was the most intense focus of constraints. It was spoken of more than anything else. More than any other relation, it was required to give a detailed accounting of itself. It was under constant surveillance. If it was found to be lacking, it had to come forward and plead its case before a witness. The rest remained a good deal more confused. One only has to think of the uncertain status of sodomy or the indifference regarding the sexuality of children. Moreover, these different codes did not make a clear distinction between violations of the rules of marriage and deviations with respect to genitality. Breaking the rules of marriage or seeking strange pleasures brought an equal measure of condemnation. On the list of grave sins, and separated only by their relative importance, there appeared debauchery, extramarital relations, adultery, rape, spiritual or carnal incest, but also sodomy, or the mutual caress. As to the courts, they could condemn homosexuality as well as infidelity, marriage without parental consent, or bestiality. What was taken into account in the civil and religious jurisdictions alike was a general unlawfulness. Doubtless acts contrary to nature were stamped as especially abominable, but they were perceived simply as an extreme form of acts against the law. They were infringements of decrees which were just as sacred as those of marriage, and which had been established for governing the order of things and the plan of beings. Prohibitions bearing on sex were essentially of a juridical nature. The nature on which they were based was still a kind of law. For a long time hermaphrodites were criminals, or crime's offspring, since their anatomical disposition, their very being, confounded the law that distinguished the sexes and prescribed their union. The discursive explosion of the 18th and 19th centuries caused this system centered on legitimate alliance to undergo two modifications. First, a centrifugal movement with respect to heterosexual monogamy. Of course, the array of practices and pleasures continued to be referred to it as their internal standard, but it was spoken of less and less, or in any case with a growing moderation. Efforts to find out its secrets were abandoned. Nothing further was demanded of it than to define itself from day to day. The legitimate couple, with its regular sexuality, had a right to more discretion. It tended to function as a norm, one that was stricter perhaps, but quieter. On the other hand, what came under scrutiny was the sexuality of children, madmen and women, and criminals, the sensuality of those who did not like the opposite sex, reveries, obsessions, petty manias, or great transports of rage. It was time for all these figures, scarcely noticed in the past, to step forward and speak, to make the difficult confession of what they were. No doubt they were condemned all the same, but they were listened to, and if regular sexuality happened to be questioned once again, it was through a reflux movement, originating in these peripheral sexualities. Whence the setting apart of the unnatural as a specific dimension in the field of sexuality. This kind of activity assumed an autonomy with regard to the other condemned forms, such as adultery or rape, and the latter were condemned less and less. To marry a close relative or practice sodomy, to seduce a nun or engage in sadism, to deceive one's wife or violate cadavers became things that were essentially different. The area covered by the sixth commandment began to fragment. Similarly, in the civil order, the confused category of debauchery, which for more than a century had been one of the most frequent reasons for administrative confinement, came apart. From the débris there appeared on the one hand infractions against the legislation or morality pertaining to marriage and the family, and on the other offences against the regularity of a natural function. Offences which, it must be added, the law was apt to punish. Here we have a likely reason, among others, for the prestige of Don Juan, which 3 centuries have not erased. Underneath the great violator of the rules of marriage, stealer of wives, seducer of virgins, the shame of families, and an insult to husbands and fathers, another personage can be glimpsed, the individual driven, in spite of himself, by the sombre madness of sex. Underneath the libertine, the pervert. He deliberately breaks the law, but at the same time something like a nature gone awry transports him far from all nature. His death is the moment when the supernatural return of the crime and its retribution thwarts the flight into counter-nature. There were 2 great systems conceived by the West for governing sex, the law of marriage and the order of desires, and the life of Don Juan overturned them both. We shall leave it to psychoanalysts to speculate whether he was homosexual, narcissistic, or impotent. Although not without delay and equivocation, the natural laws of matrimony and the immanent rules of sexuality began to be recorded on 2 separate registers. There emerged a world of perversion which partook of that legal or moral infraction, yet was not simply a variety of the latter. An entire sub-race was born, different, despite certain kinship ties, from the libertines of the past. From the end of the 18th century to our own, they circulated through the pores of society. They were always hounded, but not always by laws, were often locked up, but not always in prisons, were sick, perhaps, but scandalous, dangerous victims, prey to a strange evil that also bore the name of vice and sometimes crime. They were children wise beyond their years, precocious little girls, ambiguous schoolboys, dubious servants and educators, cruel or maniacal husbands, solitary collectors, ramblers with bizarre impulses. They haunted the houses of correction, the penal colonies, the tribunals, and the asylums. They carried their infamy to the doctors and their sickness to the judges. This was the numberless family of perverts who were on friendly terms with delinquents and akin to madmen. In the course of the century they successively bore the stamp of moral folly, genital neurosis, aberration of the genetic instinct, degenerescence, or physical imbalance. What does the appearance of all these peripheral sexualities signify? Is the fact that they could appear in broad daylight a sign that the code had become more lax? Or does the fact that they were given so much attention testify to a stricter regime and to its concern to bring them under close supervision? In terms of repression, things are unclear. There was permissiveness if one bears in mind that the severity of the codes relating to sexual offences diminished considerably in the 19th century, and that law itself often deferred to medicine. But an additional ruse of severity if one thinks of all the agencies of control and all the mechanisms of surveillance that were put into operation by pedagogy or therapeutics. It may be the case that the intervention of the Church in conjugal sexuality and its rejection of frauds against procreation had lost much of their insistence over the previous 200 years. But medicine made a forceful entry into the pleasures of the couple. It created an entire organic, functional, or mental pathology arising out of incomplete sexual practices. It carefully classified all forms of related pleasures. It incorporated them into the notions of development and instinctual disturbances, and it undertook to manage them. Perhaps the point to consider is not the level of indulgence or the quantity of repression, but the form of power that was exercised. When this whole thicket of disparate sexualities was labelled as if to disentangle them from one another, was the object to exclude them from reality? It appears, in fact, that the function of the power exerted in this instance was not that of interdiction, and that it involved 4 operations quite different from simple prohibition. 1. Take the ancient prohibitions of consanguine marriages, as numerous and complex as they were, or the condemnation of adultery, with its inevitable frequency of occurrence. Or, on the other hand, the recent controls through which, since the 19th century, the sexuality of children has been subordinated and their solitary habits interfered with. It is clear that we are not dealing with one and the same power mechanism, not only because in the one case it is a question of law and penalty, and in the other medicine and regimentation, but also because the tactics employed is not the same. On the surface, what appears in both cases is an effort at elimination that was always destined to fail and always constrained to begin again. But the prohibition of incests attempted to reach its objective through an asymptotic decrease in the thing it condemned, whereas the control of infantile sexuality hoped to reach it through a simultaneous propagation of its own power and of the object on which it was brought to bear. It proceeded in accordance with a twofold increase extended indefinitely. Educators and doctors combated children's onanism like an epidemic that needed to be eradicated. What this actually entailed throughout this whole secular campaign that mobilized the adult world around the sex of children was using these tenuous pleasures as a prop, constituting them as secrets, that is, forcing them into hiding so as to make possible their discovery, tracing them back to their source, tracking them from their origins to their effects, searching out everything that might cause them or simply enable them to exist. Wherever there was the chance they might appear, devices of surveillance were installed, traps were laid for compelling admissions, inexhaustible and corrective discourses were imposed. Parents and teachers were alerted and left with the suspicion that all children were guilty, and with the fear of being themselves at fault if their suspicions were not sufficiently strong. They were kept in readiness in the face of this recurrent danger. Their conduct was prescribed and their pedagogy recodified. An entire medico-sexual regime took hold of the family milieu. The child's vice was not so much an enemy as a support. It may have been designated as the evil to be eliminated, but the extraordinary effort that went into the task that was bound to fail leads one to suspect that what was demanded of it was to persevere, to proliferate to the limits of the visible and the invisible, rather than to disappear for good. Always relying on this support, power advanced, multiplied its relays and its effects, while its target expanded, subdivided, and branched out, penetrating further into reality at the same pace. In appearance, we are dealing with a barrier system, but in fact, all around the child, indefinite lines of penetration were disposed. 2. This new persecution of the peripheral sexualities entailed an incorporation of perversions and a new specification of individuals. As defined by the ancient civil or canonical codes, sodomy was a category of forbidden acts. Their perpetrator was nothing more than the juridical subject of them. The 19th century homosexual became a personage, a past, a case history, and a childhood, in addition to being a type of life, a life form, and a morphology, with an indiscrete anatomy and possibly a mysterious physiology. Nothing that went into his total composition was unaffected by his sexuality. It was everywhere present in him, at the root of all his actions, because it was their insidious and indefinitely active principle, written immodestly on his face and body because it was a secret that always gave itself away. It was consubstantial with him, less as a habitual sin than as a singular nature. We must not forget that the psychological, psychiatric, medical category of homosexuality was constituted from the moment it was characterized. Westphal's famous article of 1870 on contrary sexual sensations can stand as its date of birth, less by a type of sexual relations than by a certain quality of sexual sensibility, a certain way of inverting the masculine and the feminine in oneself. Homosexuality appeared as one of the forms of sexuality when it was transposed from the practice of sodomy onto a kind of interior androgyny, a hermaphrodism of the soul. The sodomite had been a temporary aberration. The homosexual was now a species. So too were all those minor perverts whom 19th century psychiatrists entomologized by giving them strange baptismal names. There were Krafft-Ebing's zoophiles and zoerasts, Rohleder's automonosexualists, and later mixoscopophiles, gynecomasts, presbyophiles, sexoaesthetic inverts, and Disparianist women. These fine names for heresies referred to a nature that was overlooked by the law, but not so neglectful of itself that it did not go on producing more species, even where there was no order to fit them into. The machinery of power that focused on this whole alien strain did not aim to suppress it, but rather to give it an analytical, visible, and permanent reality. It was implanted in bodies, slipped in beneath modes of conduct, made into a principle of classification and intelligibility, established as a raison d'être and a natural order of disorder. Not the exclusion of these 1,000 aberrant sexualities, but the specification, the regional solidification of each one of them. The strategy behind this dissemination was to strew reality with them and incorporate them into the individual. 3. More than the old taboos, this form of power demanded constant, attentive, and curious presences for its exercise. It presupposed proximities. It proceeded through examination and insistent observation. It required an exchange of discourses through questions that extorted admissions and confidences that went beyond the questions that were asked. It implied a physical proximity and an interplay of intense sensations. The medicalization of the sexually peculiar was both the effect and the instrument of this. Embedded in bodies, becoming deeply characteristic of individuals, the oddities of sex relied on a technology of health and pathology. And conversely, since sexuality was a medical and medicalizable object, one had to try and detect it as a lesion, a dysfunction, or a symptom in the depths of the organism, or on the surface of the skin, or among all the signs of behavior. The power which thus took charge of sexuality set about contacting bodies, caressing them with its eyes, intensifying areas, electrifying surfaces, dramatizing troubled moments. It wrapped the sexual body in its embrace. There was undoubtedly an increase in effectiveness and an extension of the domain controlled, but also a sensualization of power and a gain of pleasure. This produced a twofold effect. An impetus was given to power through its very exercise. An emotion rewarded the overseeing control and carried it further. The intensity of the confession renewed the questioner's curiosity. The pleasure discovered fed back to the power that encircled it. But so many pressing questions singularized the pleasures felt by the one who had to reply. They were fixed by a gaze, isolated and animated by the attention they received. Power operated as a mechanism of attraction. It drew out those peculiarities over which it kept watch. Pleasure spread to the power that harried it. Power anchored the pleasure it uncovered. The medical examination, the psychiatric investigation, the pedagogical report, and family controls may have the overall and apparent objective of saying no to all wayward or unproductive sexualities, but the fact is that they function as mechanisms with a double impetus, pleasure and power. The pleasure that comes of exercising a power that questions, monitors, watches, spies, searches out, palpates, brings to light. And on the other hand, the pleasure that kindles at having to evade this power, flee from it, fool it, or travesty it. The power that lets itself be invaded by the pleasure it is pursuing, and opposite it, power asserting itself in the pleasure of showing off, scandalizing, or resisting. Capture and seduction, confrontation and mutual reinforcement. Parents and children, adults and adolescents, educator and students, doctors and patients, the psychiatrist with his hysteric and his perverts, all have played this game continually since the 19th century. These attractions, these evasions, these circular incitements have traced around bodies and sexes not boundaries not to be crossed, but perpetual spirals of power and pleasure. 4. Whence those devices of sexual saturation so characteristic of the space and the social rituals of the 19th century. People often say that modern society has attempted to reduce sexuality to the couple, the heterosexual and, insofar as possible, legitimate couple. There are equal grounds for saying that it has, if not created, at least outfitted and made to proliferate groups with multiple elements and a circulating sexuality, a distribution of points of power, hierarchized and placed opposite to one another, pursued pleasures, that is, both sought after and searched out, compartmental sexualities that are tolerated or encouraged, proximities that serve as surveillance procedures and function as mechanisms of intensification, contacts that operate as inductors. This is the way things worked in the case of the family, or rather the household, with parents, children, and in some instances servants. Was the 19th century family really a monogamic and conjugal cell? Perhaps to a certain extent. But it was also a network of pleasures and powers linked together at multiple points and according to transformable relationships. The separation of grown-ups and children, the polarity established between the parents' bedroom and that of the children, it became routine in the course of the century when working-class housing construction was undertaken, the relative segregation of boys and girls, the strict instructions as to the care of nursing infants, maternal breastfeeding, hygiene, the attention focused on infantile sexuality, the supposed dangers of masturbation, the importance attached to puberty, the methods of surveillance suggested to parents, the exhortations, secrets, and fears, the presence, both valued and feared, of servants, all this made the family, even when brought down to its smallest dimensions, a complicated network saturated with multiple fragmentary and mobile sexualities. To reduce them to the conjugal relationship and then to project the latter in the form of a forbidden desire onto the children cannot account for this apparatus, which, in relation to these sexualities, was less a principle of inhibition than an inciting and multiplying mechanism. Educational or psychiatric institutions, with their large populations, their hierarchies, their spatial arrangements, their surveillance systems, constituted, alongside the family, another way of distributing the interplay of powers and pleasures. But they too delineated areas of extreme sexual saturation, with privileged spaces or rituals such as the classroom, the dormitory, the visit, and the consultation. The forms of a non-conjugal, non-monogamous sexuality were drawn there and established. 19th century bourgeois society, and it is doubtless still with us, was a society of blatant and fragmented perversion. And this was not by way of hypocrisy, for nothing was more manifest and more prolix, or more manifestly taken over by discourses and institutions. not because, having tried to erect too rigid or too general a barrier against sexuality, society succeeded only in giving rise to a whole perverse outbreak and a long pathology of the sexual instinct. At issue, rather, is the type of power it brought to bear on the body and on sex. In point of fact, this power had neither the form of the law nor the effects of the taboo. On the contrary, it acted by multiplication of singular sexualities. It did not set boundaries for sexuality, it extended the various forms of sexuality, pursuing them according to lines of indefinite penetration. It did not exclude sexuality, but included it in the body as a mode of specification of individuals. It did not seek to avoid it, it attracted its varieties by means of spirals in which pleasure and power reinforced one another. It did not set up a barrier, it provided places of maximum saturation. It produced and determined the sexual mosaic. Modern society is perverse, not in spite of its Puritanism, or as if from a backlash provoked by its hypocrisy. It is in actual fact and directly perverse. In actual fact. The manifold sexualities, those which appear with the different ages, sexualities of the infant or the child, those which become fixated on particular tastes or practices, the sexuality of the invert, the gerontophile, the fetishist, those which, in a diffuse manner, invest relationships, the sexuality of doctor and patient, teacher and student, psychiatrist and mental patient, those which haunt spaces, the sexuality of the home, the school, the prison, all form the correlate of exact procedures of power. We must not imagine that all these things that were formerly tolerated attracted notice and received a pejorative designation when the time came to give a regulative role to the one type of sexuality that was capable of reproducing labor power and the form of the family. These polymorphous conducts were actually extracted from people's bodies and from their pleasures, or rather they were solidified in them. They were drawn out, revealed, isolated, intensified, incorporated by multifarious power devices. The growth of perversions is not a moralizing theme that obsessed the scrupulous minds of the Victorians. It is the real product of the encroachment of a type of power on bodies and their pleasures. It is possible that the West has not been capable of inventing any new pleasures, and it has doubtless not discovered any original vices. But it has defined new rules for the game of powers and pleasures. The frozen countenance of the perversions is a fixture of this game. Directly. This implantation of multiple perversions is not a mockery of sexuality taking revenge on a power that has thrust on it an excessively repressive law. Neither are we dealing with paradoxical forms of pleasure that turn back on power and invest it in the form of a pleasure to be endured. The implantation of perversions is an instrument effect. It is through the isolation, intensification, and consolidation of peripheral sexualities that the relations of power to sex and pleasure branched out and multiplied, measured the body, and penetrated modes of conduct. And accompanying this encroachment of powers, scattered sexualities rigidified, became stuck to an age, a place, a type of practice. A proliferation of sexualities through the extension of power, an optimization of the power to which each of these local sexualities gave a surface of intervention. This concatenation, particularly since the 19th century, has been ensured and relayed by the countless economic interests which, with the help of medicine, psychiatry, prostitution, and pornography, have tapped into both this analytical multiplication of pleasure and this optimization of the power that controls it. Pleasure and power do not cancel or turn back against one another. They seek out, overlap, and reinforce one another. They are linked together by complex mechanisms and devices of excitation and incitement. We must therefore abandon the hypothesis that modern industrial societies ushered in an age of increased sexual repression. We have not only witnessed a visible explosion of unorthodox sexualities, but, and this is the important point, a deployment quite different from the law, even if it is locally dependent on procedures of prohibition, has ensured, through a network of interconnecting mechanisms, the proliferation of specific pleasures and the multiplication of disparate sexualities. It is said that no society has been more prudish. Never have the agencies of power taken such care to feign ignorance of the thing they prohibited, as if they were determined to have nothing to do with it. But it is the opposite that has become apparent, at least after a general review of the facts. Never have there existed more centres of power, never more attention manifested and verbalized, never more circular contacts and linkages, never more sites where the intensity of pleasures and the persistency of power catch hold, only to spread elsewhere.